I'm really interested in talking about the politics of all this. And I wonder, Sarah, if you might start by telling us how you see the state of play, how it may have changed or may not have changed over the last few years, and, where the politics you think are heading.
Now, I do want to start by saying thank you to you. I read The Uninhabitable Earth on an airplane. That was a mistake. But I've been scribbling out the policy footnotes ever since. So thank you. And I'm so delighted to be here. Especially, I want to thank David Keith and Michael Greenstone and the whole team here for putting together an incredible room. It is so strange to be in a room with the entire swath of the carbon removal movement. I feel like I'm at one of my conferences for conservatives, where we have everyone from MAGA to the religious right to the Chamber of Commerce to the Never Trumpers. Well, here we have carbon removal in the glacier crowd, the SRM crowd. I think there's some marine CDR folks in the room. That's pretty exciting. So I'm glad you're all here. I would like to say that I have prepared my remarks on the politics specifically around geoengineering. I would like to say a couple of things about the Rainey Center to give you also further context on my perspective. Briefly, we're a leadership community and a think tank. We're named for Joseph Rainey, the first Black American to serve in the U.S. House. We are non-traditional conservatives, the ones you didn't know existed, the girl ones, the gay ones, the brown ones, the Jewish ones, etc. Yes, exactly. We work with hundreds of federal and state policymakers on energy, environment, technology, national security, and democracy. We are one of the only center-right shops with strong, active relationships across the full bench. Policy is an ecosystem that runs up and down the food chain. It's not just states for some things and not just the federal government for other things. It all runs together. That's a little bit contrarian, revelatory, rebellious viewpoint, but it is mine, and that's how we operate. What we do is we try to find policy answers that will survive changes of administration and voter mood swings. On this panel, I've been asked to speak about the right and geoengineering and politics. I'll make 3 quick points and then pass it on to Ricken, who maybe will even argue with me about some of them. That could be exciting. Yeah, exactly. 1, there is no single conservative position on climate systems engineering. If you tried to fit a single factor model to conservative opinion on this, your R-squared would embarrass you. Oh, somebody took statistics here. Yeah, I was a political science major, and I have 4 siblings with STEM terminal degrees. So, I had to get that out there. There are at least 4 camps: national security hawks, energy realists, federalist skeptics, and a small but loud weather modification opposition. Hi, Maha Moms. It's nice to see you. They want very different things. Treating them as one block has been the single most consistent strategic error in this field on the political side. 2, the public is well ahead of our elected officials. Rainey Center polling last month found 55% of Americans support atmospheric research under strict government oversight. 7% want a ban. That is roughly 8-1. Republican voters move with the national average. The political opposition is real but narrow, and it is louder than it is large. 3, the conservative answer to the field is not prohibition. It is sovereignty. If you remember nothing else about what I say today, American skies, American rules, American science. Monitoring, transparency, accountability to the government, accountability to communities, and a clear federal pathway so that serious researchers and fly-by-night operators no longer face the same regulatory environment, which, as we know right now, is practically none. I look forward to Ricken's read on the left, mostly because I suspect we agree on more of the architecture than the labels suggest. We may have a marketing problem.
Ricken, before I get to you, I just want to ask a quick follow-up of Sarah, which is you mentioned sovereignty, and that is one useful way of thinking about, I think, a lot of folks' reflexive skepticism about this. And I don't just mean that in the American context regarding American governance, but in the global context about who's actually in charge of the weather, how are they making those decisions. If the lay American or the lay citizen of the world has that reflexive concern about sovereignty and about handing over control of the system to anybody. How do we assuage that? What is a path towards resolving that anxiety?
Let me repeat the question because I want to make sure I understand it. You are asking about anxiety about geoengineering or
Yeah.
anxiety about sovereignty or both?
The sovereignty of any geoengineering program that
Mhm.
is being proposed, in the sense that you mentioned we want your read of the conservative position here is we want American governance of American skies. But skies aren't just American. These programs presumably won't just be American, although they might be. And if they are, other people in the world will say, why are these Americans messing with our skies? So how do you think about addressing those concerns about sovereignty if we're pursuing a program of not just small-scale research, but actual deployment of geoengineering?
So, what I would say is that when you fill the vacuum with monitoring and transparency, public opposition and the politics change quickly. Republicans, for example, they favor oversight by an 8-1 margin. They support ocean alkalinity at 79%. I have copies of our latest polling downstairs when you're leaving if you want to grab it. The state level bans that we've all read about are a symptom of a vacuum and not a stable preference. And even if you think about climate writ large, what is the one? I've had so many fights about this. I've had a lot of fights about this next statement that I'm about to make. There's one binding part of the Paris Agreement. And what is that?
Is this a quiz or?
No, you know what it is. I'm okay. I was kind of asking because I figured you know. He does know. It's reporting. It is accurate reporting. It is transparency in reporting. And if we want to be good neighbors, we need to be transparent and have good governance and accurately report what we're doing in this area. And frankly, that is the path to getting social license for this technology. The reflexive opposition narrative comes from a real place, but it's narrow. We've been engaged on our Sister C4 side in some of these state-level ban fights. A handful of legislatures have moved bills that framed banning of this research in particular as weather modification. Those bills are doing two things at once. They are responding to a genuine information vacuum, and they are codifying misinformation into statute. But the honest read here is that the conservative public is curious and conditionally supportive. I think what's happened, and the way that we're seeing this play out, is that the conservative elected class has not been given a usable alternative or just not a widely available alternative. So they've filled the space with the available framing, which is a ban, although I do want to say that the Rainey Center Freedom Project has killed more of these bans than states that have actually passed them. Our argument, however, goes back to how do you soothe the anxiety? Our argument is that monitoring is the conservative position. Transparency is the conservative position. Accountability to government and communities and at the national level to other nation states is the conservative position. If we do not write the rules, if we are not at the table, then we will not like how they come out at the end. And that is true at the state level, it's true at the federal level, and it's true at the international level.
Ricken, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see this from your perspective, which is to say from the left, but also somewhat from the activist left, and how you see the energy there changing over the past few years and maybe into the future. Sovereignty is actually a complaint you hear from the left too, a concern you hear from the left too. And yet it feels to me, tell me if I'm projecting, that the intensity of opposition to research into this and even deployment of it seems to be diminishing a bit over the recent past. How do you see how things have evolved over the last few years and where you think the politics of the left on geoengineering is going?
Pass the tech test. All right. Thanks. And yeah, also beginning with gratitude. Thank you for this room. Thank you for this crew. And thank you for the discussions. They've been fantastic, right? Really, really lovely discussions. And I think building a field is about articulating the DNA of that field. And I can feel really good DNA in this room, including in the kind of respectful, civil, kind of open discussion amongst people. And that kind of leads into my answer to your question, I think. I also have to say that the left-right dynamic here. Like, I know you have a great history of post-partisan kind of work, and I also come from a deliberative background. The organizations I founded were not ideological, but deliberative democratic. So just, but yes, a lot of my friends are progressive, and I'm coming out of that climate activist history. So, and yeah, things are changing. I thought when I first took up this work, I was going to get killed. It was going to take a big reputational hit, and I was going to be the bad guy for a while. But then I went and talked to all of my friends who were climate leadership. And I keep going through that experience where someone says, oh yeah, but don't talk to them because they're going to bite your head off and be absolutely furious. And then I go and talk to them and it's like hope, like they're suffering. Remember that graph that put up at the beginning with the like innovation and then you're down in the doldrums? Yeah, it was a good graph. I really liked that. I was like, Manish and I were like, we could apply this to a lot of things, right? Like the climate movement is down there in those doldrums to some degree in some places. And there's a need for hope. And if you can come at this the right way, and that's what I come back to the spirit of the thing. If you can come at this in a way that you say, not we failed, but wow, we have engendered an energy transition that's underway. It is happening. But is it fast enough? Have we done the job? Have we protected people and planet? And the answer is always no. And then do we have a plan for what to do in overshoot? Can we stop these tipping points and feedback loops? Do we know what to do? And the answer is always no. Should we figure out what to do? Should we be science-led and evidence-based? Should we look for safe, just, and sustainable solutions? And the answer is always yes. Because people are just human, right? No labels, just good humans thinking about their kids and their futures. Everybody comes down on the same side of this. And so that's where I would apply that politically and say, we've done the same thing. We've done surveys, 40,000 people, including focus groups, US and UK so far, expanding to other countries. If you adopt frames that aren't left or right coded, so if you talk about climate instability, for example, rather than climate change, you've got, even in the United States, 70, 80% of Republicans saying, yeah, we want to see research on these issues. So it's interesting to compare data. I'll share that with you. And so all of that gives me hope that there is a big tent rooted in kind of moral clarity, human movement here to be built that just writes the next chapter in the story of human beings grappling with climate change. We've had mitigation, we've had adaptation, we need stabilization now, or whatever word you want to call it. We need the next chapter in order to protect people and planet.
And is your view that those responses have been relatively steady, and it would have been the case 5 or 8 years ago that people would have been eager to support research into these areas, or do you think that it's changed?
Yeah, no, that's why I thought I was going to take a hit. Is that I remember when I first said to my team at Avaaz that a woman was just in tears saying, we've lost, humanity's over. And I said, well, even if we do fail on mitigation, there are options. There are things we can do. And my whole team sort of was up in arms of like, oh, how could you? I can't believe he said that. And they all had meetings with me afterwards and they said, what are you doing? It was seen as betrayal. Just as adaptation was once seen as betrayal, as that great quote was read out at the beginning. And I think there's just people who get in love with their solution and forget to be in love with the problem. Forget to say, this is a problem and we need a solution to it. And I think that's also a good cautionary tale for all of us, right? Because I found our field has sometimes been, this nascent field, as small as it is, has sometimes been stuck on just being in love with one particular solution and seeing themselves at odds with others. But I think the truth of the science of this is that there are many things. You saw many solutions put up at the beginning: cloud thinning, marine cloud brightening, carbon dioxide removal, stratospheric aerosol injection. They're all pieces of the puzzle potentially, and we should be going full bore at all of them and have this spirit of openness, of rootedness in results of how do we fix this problem, and a real openness of dialogue with each other about the science and about being evidence-based and results-focused. And so, yeah, we were there. A lot of the field is still there, absolutely. But when you come with that orientation I'm describing, I find it falls away really quickly.
And what about at the institutional level? When we think about some of the questions we were talking about in the last conversation about trust, and it's one thing to ask a set of questions on a survey, it's one thing to be in a focus group with people. It's another thing to present a particular program that has been sort of authorized by a particular group of people and is being implemented by a particular group of people, and ask not just a small community of people who have had access to those decision makers, but the entire global community to sign on. How do you think about that landscape of trust? How much it's changed over the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whether we're overstating the degree of social distrust in the US and globally, and what we can do to make sure, if we're undertaking the engineering of the planet, the systems engineering of the planet, which is what we're talking about, how we can go about doing so with the support of the people who are being most affected. Sarah, I want to ask you first.
All right. That was a long question, and I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to ask you to reframe it again. You're asking about trust in the context of these political conversations, or in the context of climate generally, or geoengineering?
Geoengineering.
Okay.
We're now, I think, in America, kind of incontrovertibly, in a position of in a moment of anti-institutional feeling, anti-elite feeling. This is a program, when we talk about, which is almost inevitably conducted by certain actors on behalf of the planet as a whole. There are ways of adjusting that framework and democratizing the systems that authorize it, in theory, but we're talking about, literally engineering the system, the climate system of the planet. And I think that runs up against a crisis of trust, which is present and kind of unmistakable in the US, and I think to a certain degree all around the world. So how do we think about undertaking such a large project and securing the necessary public trust to do it?
So I think a lot about what durable climate policy looks like, not just here, but across the wide range of things that we have to do to address the climate crisis. I think when it comes to geoengineering in particular, there are 3 things that our focus groups, our policymaker conversations that are polling what we're experiencing on the ground work. And one is, there needs to be a clear statutory line between research and deployment. The conversation that you have saying, we need to research this technology, we need to research this technology to stay competitive, we need to understand the national security applications of these technologies in case we need to defend ourselves from weaponization of them by other actors. That is a very different conversation from, okay, let's deploy this technology now, and here's how we're going to do it and why. You have to have both conversations, and you have to have them in a sequential order. But I think making that a very clear policy statutory line and understanding that those are 2 different conversations is critical. Second, I think I feel really strange saying this as a conservative, because usually, I am a limited government person, but this is about everyone's skies. This is an inherently transboundary technology. And so we need some kind of federal registry and federal oversight that is public, so that people know what's going on and that they know in advance. I think that kind of information is key, because the more people know and understand about something, actually, the less scarier it tends to get. Third, I think we need to make it clear especially when we get to deployment conversations, that real state, local, tribal, and multinational conversations, they need to happen upstream. And different communities that are going to be impacted need to be engaged. What that engagement looks like might vary from state to county to government to nation, but we need to have processes that will allow for genuine consultation and engagement. And I'm actually somewhat optimistic on this and other environmental issues that maybe AI will really help us do come up with different ways to engage with different communities that need to be involved in all kinds of environmental decision making in a more efficient way so that we can build faster in a way that everyone buys into. That's a bit of an aside, but I'm kind of optimistic and excited about that. Uh, and I think on the whole, my guess, and I mentioned this earlier, I really think the architecture the left wants for justice reasons and the architecture the right wants for both sovereignty, national security, and honestly, just straight up government accountability and transparency reasons, I think it's in the same building. I often like to say environmental justice in a blue state is just government accountability and transparency in a red state. What they are, like, there's a lot of overlap in the rubber meets the road of the government administration of what people need to know for both of those things. So I think the disagreement really is about what we're going to call things and marketing and branding, especially in our culture in this country, than anything else.
Ricken, if you cast your eyes a little bit forward from the question of, getting support for research to in a future world in which research has demonstrated even more than it has today the value of some of this work actually being deployed in the world, what additional steps do we need to take from there on the political side of things? Like, how do you see the governance oversight structures evolving? Or maybe a better way of putting it is, what do you think the public is going to demand as a condition on their, as a condition of their support for that kind of work?
So one just like heuristic I would highly recommend is, as I've learned in dealing with this field, is like, don't think about one technology. Like a lot of the subtext to a lot of the questions, sometimes like you're thinking about SAI in the back of your mind, right? But there's a bunch of technologies that could shave like 0.1, 0.2, 0.4 degrees off the trajectory. So even if we never did SAI, you could save the world, potentially, if you optimize for all these other technologies, right? And each one of them has a different trust profile, a different kind of research and deployment profile, a different kind of, and it matters which country you're talking about, like how that trust is going to land. Like I agree with all the previous comments about how the withdrawal from the climate agenda has largely been the United States and to a lesser extent Europe. It really hasn't happened in a lot of other places in the world, and the relationship with institutions of trust very different. So my brain splits into like, are you talking about MCB? Because you could win that right away, like a sulfur swap could go through the London Protocol within like a few years. We need the nozzle technology. We need it recreates the pattern of warming we've seen from the container ships already. There's no unknowns there really. It's even better to have a salt rather than a sulfur. That's a doable proposition in the near term. If you talk about SAI, it's kind of at the other end of the spectrum. Like there are some unknowns there that need to be figured out by research, and there's a huge trust task to be built there. And for that, I would say realistically, there's a relation between the problem and the orientation towards it. Like you can see, we just put 8 billion people under house arrest for a year, right? Like once there's a clear problem that everybody's focused on, that equation shifts very rapidly. And so I think politically, what I think a lot of this field is engaged in is the prep for the moment when the publics all of a sudden wake up to tipping points and feedback loops, and they start to demand action. And I think that's begun happening in certain countries. But that's gonna address some of the trust issue. But then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that I think you have mentioned as well. So sorry, your question was about governance. I was answering your first question, but on the governance thing, I do agree with. It's going to be states. It's going to be many-lateral solutions. It's going to be coalitions of states, I think, that have power, legitimacy, and resources. Those are going to be the three things. And I think that countries like India actually have a lot of all three of those things. Like there's a chance that India is actually going to proceed on this agenda fairly rapidly without really anyone getting in the way, and then be able to anchor a wider coalition of states. I think Kenya, Ghana, like there's a bunch of states that are already at the high level interested and concerned at a level that you could ground a group of states that have power, legitimacy, and resources that are trusted enough to move on some of these solutions. So I think that's where we sit right now.
I mean, I'm all for that kind of structure, kind of across the issue space, and I'm big fan of new multipolarity and middle powers. I wonder/worry a little bit like how the U.S. would take it if there was a coalition of 8 other countries that were undertaking standard setting here. I don't think it would go over well.
Well, I would just preface that by saying I think there's a G2 in the world. Like India and China, if they don't want something to happen, they're probably going to be able to prevent it from happening. So in your multilateral coalition, you have to, at a minimum, have the sort of buy-in from G2 states. But partly due to the rivalry between those states and their difficulty working together, there's space for norm setting, there's space for investment in research, there's space for diplomatic progress amongst other states.
Sarah, before we go, and just as a kind of a last question, I wonder, since we've talked so much about geoengineering, and I know that is the subject of, that's why we're here. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you see the evolution of conservative thinking on climate more generally, and where we might project a post-Trump conservative intellectual coalition to evolve.
Wow. I feel like so many of my thoughts on that are classified. um, Windmills are going to be back, baby. They're going to be everywhere. Big, beautiful windmills as far as the eye can see. I kind of hope so in some places. It really makes sense. The post-Trump world is going to be interesting. I'm interested to see how it's going to play out. I do like to tell some of my friends on the left that in just a couple of years, Donald Trump will be as relevant as George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden. Like, it's okay, and then somebody else will be in charge. And I think the orientation of the next leader of the party on these issues is going to matter. I think that the orientation of some of the donor class on these issues is going to matter. I mean, you could see a very interesting peek into the future playing out in Louisiana right now. You have one candidate in their Senate primary who will be in a runoff and is probably going to do better than everyone thinks. He has a very good chance, actually, I think, of winning. I was just down there a couple of weeks ago with some of our legislators and at the governor's mansion, and his name is John Fleming. He's attacking Julia Letlow, attacking Bill Cassidy, attacking Governor Landry on carbon capture, which is directly in opposition to the interests of the Louisiana oil and gas industry. So I think we're going to see some very unique, I think we might see some continued unique, increasingly less unique, kind of strange far left, far right alliances. You have the far left in Louisiana allied with the far right in Louisiana to stop carbon capture. And I think we will see that perhaps in other areas. We're seeing it in NIMBYism. Like right now, we can't even build a data center. So, we can, but it's getting really hard. A huge number of projects are being canceled in large part due to community opposition. And part of that's because of misinformation. And I think along those lines, like, how are we going to build transmission lines? How are we going to... We're never going to do any refining of critical minerals in this country, which is essential for the energy transition, period. A wind turbine and a solar panel and nuclear power, these are all monuments to the mining industry. So I think that is where a lot of the energy is going to go, is looking at how do we, in this country, on climate, I think it's going to be very, on the right in particular, it's going to be very practical about what do we build, where and when. And we're going to have these different constituencies. Like you're going to have Maha here, you're going to have oil and gas here. Big, beautiful bill. I couldn't believe how many meetings that I was going into with the oil and gas industry, and we would be on the same side talking to Republicans who disagreed with us. It was an out-of-body experience. And I think that, that's what we're going to be managing, are some interesting coalition dynamics, largely around what are we going to build, where, when, and how, and dealing with misinformation. And hopefully the next Republican Party leader will be someone who can really cut through some of the noise and misinformation and help us build things. I think President Trump is actually trying, but he's got other priorities, and he's been, distracted a bit by his foreign policy agenda, which I generally support, and I'm happy he's doing it. Just to be very clear.
Ricken, I wanted to ask you a version of the same question, which is, we've all observed the sort of trajectory of activist energy coming up from the left on climate. We've lived through a recent period in which there was a huge global upsurge, and now something of a cessation. You were talking earlier about feeling like geoengineering may be one way out of the doldrums for people who kind of went over that hill and ended up in the trough. How do you see in the big picture the activist energy evolving on climate? You mentioned a minute or two ago, in the context of another question, when people start to wake up and demand more, like, do you think that we're heading back to a position of broad public outrage and activist energy, or do you think we're going to be living in a sort of a period of cessation as we are now for a while?
Yeah, I don't like to think of myself as old. But one of the advantages of having done an advocacy agenda for 20, 30 years is you get to see these rhythms and cycles. And this moment reminds me a little bit of after Copenhagen, after 2009, the climate movement kind of died. It was like, oh, we failed and, we're never going to be able to go anywhere with this. And everybody was telling me this issue is too wonky. It's too long term. It's nobody's top issue. It'll never be a high level political issue. And I think the analogy to this moment that I would bring is that we wanted a Copenhagen agreement that was fair, ambitious, and binding. We wanted a binding global legal treaty. And the Americans at the time said, no way is that going to happen. Never get it through Senate, and we don't want to do it anyways. And we didn't back off that. But what we did is learn our lesson and stop pushing for binding. And now we've got an energy transition that is powered, by exactly what George W. Bush said it was going to be powered by, which is technology change. But we learned that lesson earlier, and we focused Copenhagen on a kind of, we focused the Paris Climate Summit on a kind of enthusiasm rallying cry to send a signal to the private sector to do the energy transition. That was one of our core theories of change. That's why there wasn't it was about a signaling. And so the analogy to now, I think, is that the climate movement needs to understand that we're not done with mitigation. There's no scenario in which we'd get this job done without mitigation. That is the only long-term solution. And we need to accelerate mitigation. We'd go after methane and kind of all the stuff that's fast acting. But we have fast-acting problems that we need fast-acting solutions to, and we need to embrace them as part of the climate fight. And if it's integrated as part of the climate fight, then I think it breathes new life. It gives a new chapter. That's what I'm experiencing in these conversations, and I don't know whether that's how it will play out, but that's my hope. Because if that's the case, there are a million rooms this size of infrastructure, money. There's $500 million in methane mitigation right now that Sequoia has just put in. There's just an enormous infrastructure we can bring to bear on this problem. If just all the people who spent their lives dedicated to this problem recognize that this is their problem, it's as simple as that. Say, this is the fight, guys, So that makes me hopeful.
Well, on that note, thank you guys. Thanks to you both.